The air hung heavy over the village of Oakhaven. A storm brewed on the horizon, mirroring the grief that had settled upon its inhabitants. The source of Oakhaven's grief was a somber procession making its way up the winding path to the hilltop cemetery. At its heart, a simple coffin, draped in lilies and borne upon the shoulders of men with heavy hearts. They were laying to rest Hannah, a woman loved by all who knew her, a woman taken too soon. The mourners, a tapestry of faces etched with grief, followed the coffin. Among the mourners walked Father Michael, the village priest. His face, usually a beacon of serenity, was creased with concern. He led the procession, his voice a low murmur as he recited the ancient rites for the departed. The coffin was lowered into its final resting place. The mourners, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of lanterns, gathered around the grave. Father Michael, his head bowed, sprinkled earth onto the coffin. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," he intoned, his voice heavy with emotion. Sobs rippled through the crowd as the reality of their loss sunk in. Hannah was gone. A sudden clap of thunder echoed across the graveyard, startling the mourners. Rain, heavy and relentless, began to fall, drenching the mourners and their grief. Amidst the mourners stood Duke, a large grey dog with soulful eyes. He had been Hannah's constant companion, her shadow, her confidant. Now he stood at the edge of her grave, whining softly, his tail tucked between his legs. Suddenly, Duke's demeanor changed. He stiffened, his ears pricked, his eyes fixed on the coffin. A low growl rumbled in his chest, escalating into a sharp, frantic bark. The mourners, startled by the dog's outburst, turned to see what had disturbed him. Father Michael, his face pale, watched the dog with growing apprehension. "It's just the storm," he said, his voice strained. "He's just afraid." At that moment, a tall, dark-haired man pushed his way through the mourners. His name was David, a newcomer to Oakhaven, drawn to the village by a strange premonition. David knelt beside the agitated dog, his hand outstretched. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice calm and reassuring. Duke, as if recognizing a kindred spirit, leaned into David's touch, his bark subsiding into whimpers. David's gaze followed Duke's to the coffin, then shifted to Father Michael. The priest stood rigid, his face ashen, his eyes fixed on the ground. A wave of unease washed over David. There was something amiss here, something deeply unsettling. The rain hammered down, a relentless torrent that mirrored the turmoil brewing in the hearts of the mourners. Father Michael, his voice tight with suppressed emotion, continued the funeral rites, but his words were drowned out by Duke's insistent barking. The mourners, their initial shock giving way to unease, shifted uncomfortably. Whispers like the rustle of dead leaves snaked through the crowd. What had gotten into Hannah's usually gentle dog? Why did he seem so agitated, so frightened? "Never seen a dog act like that at a funeral," muttered an elderly man. Duke, oblivious to the murmurs around him, continued to bark, his mournful howls echoing through the graveyard like the cries of a lost soul. He pawed frantically at the edge of the grave, as if trying to dig his way to his beloved Hannah. A young mother, her face pale, pulled her child closer, her eyes wide with fear. David, still kneeling beside Duke, gently stroked the dog's rain-soaked fur, his brow furrowed in thought. Duke, as if drawing comfort from David's touch, gradually calmed, his barking subsiding into whimpers. He nuzzled his head against David's leg, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored the grief of the mourners, pleading for understanding. Father Michael, his face pale and drawn, watched the exchange between David and Duke, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched in his cheek. The dog's behavior, his apparent distress, was unsettling, to say the least. The priest took a step back from the grave, his hand trembling slightly as he reached into his pocket for a handkerchief. He dabbed at his forehead, his gaze darting nervously between Duke and the coffin. David, sensing the priest's discomfort, rose to his feet, his gaze unwavering. He met Father Michael's eyes for a brief, charged moment. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and David was determined to uncover the truth.
Check, check. Check 1, check 2, check, check.
Father Michael, his face drawn and pale, cleared his throat, his voice strained as he addressed the mourners. "My friends," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, "I understand this is a difficult time for us all. Hannah's passing has left a void in our lives, and it is natural to feel a sense of disquiet." His gaze settled on Duke, who had fallen silent, his body still tense, his eyes fixed on the coffin. "Even our dear Duke," the priest continued, his voice softening slightly, "feels the weight of this loss. Animals, they sense things we do not, feel emotions more deeply." He took a hesitant step towards Duke, his hand outstretched in a gesture of comfort. "He is merely expressing his grief in his own way," Father Michael said, his voice barely a whisper now. "Let us not judge him for it. Let us not allow his distress to overshadow our love for Hannah, our memories of her kind heart and gentle spirit." The key felt cold and heavy in David's hand. It was old, the metal worn smooth with time, the intricate carvings hinting at a history long forgotten. He turned it over and over, examining it in the fading light. With Duke padding softly by his side, David made his way down the winding path from the cemetery. The storm had abated, leaving a damp, earthy smell hanging in the air. Ahead, nestled amongst the trees, lay Oakhaven, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight. A picturesque scene, yet a disquieting stillness hung over the village, a silence that spoke volumes. David's gut told him that the key, and whatever it unlocked, held the answer to the mystery surrounding Hannah's death. He had seen the fear in Father Michael's eyes, the way the priest had avoided meeting his gaze. David paused at a crossroads, his senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant barking of a dog and the creaking of a sign swinging gently in the breeze. He caught a flicker of movement in a window across the street. An elderly woman, her face half hidden behind a lace curtain, peered out at him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. As soon as their gazes met, she quickly disappeared back into the shadows. David wasn't deterred. He knew that in a village as small as Oakhaven, secrets were currency, and those who dared to pry often found themselves unwelcome. The map, tucked safely in David's pocket, led him to a small stone cottage on the outskirts of the village. It was a charming place, with a thatched roof and a garden that had once been lovingly tended. But now the garden was overgrown, the flower beds choked with weeds, the air thick with the scent of neglect. He tried the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned easily in his hand. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust motes danced in the thin shaft of light that sliced through the gloom. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dampness and decay. The cottage was sparsely furnished, but it was clear that someone had lived there recently. David lifted the box and placed it on the table. He exchanged a look with Duke, who watched him with an almost human intensity. The dog seemed to sense the importance of this discovery, his body tense, his ears pricked, his breath coming in short, shallow pants. With careful fingers, David lifted the lid of the box. It creaked softly, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets after all these years. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a stack of letters bound together with a faded ribbon. The letters were written in a flowing hand, the ink faded, but still legible. David picked one up at random and began to read. As his eyes scanned the page, a cold dread washed over him. The words swam before his eyes, forming a narrative so shocking, so horrifying that he could scarcely believe what he was reading. The weight of the metal box in his hand mirrored the weight of the truth David now carried. He had to confront Father Michael, to expose the priest's web of deceit and bring justice for Hannah. But how? The villagers revered Father Michael, trusted him implicitly. The church loomed before him, a grand, imposing structure that dominated the village skyline. Its stained glass windows, usually a source of beauty and inspiration, now seemed to mock him with their vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the darkness that festered within. Duke whined softly, nudging David's hand with his wet nose. David drew a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the church and stepped inside, Duke following close behind. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that did little to mask the underlying stench of fear and deceit that permeated the church. Father Michael stood at the altar, his back to them, his head bowed in prayer, or so it seemed. Father Michael, David's voice, though quiet, resonated through the silent church, each syllable sharp as shattered glass. The priest turned, his face a mask of surprise, quickly replaced by a cold, calculating look that sent a shiver down David's spine. "David," he acknowledged, his voice smooth, devoid of warmth. "What brings you here at this late hour?" "This," David said, holding up the metal box, "brings me here, Hannah's box." For a fleeting moment, Father Michael's composure faltered. His eyes widened, and a bead of sweat trickled down his temple, betraying the fear that gnawed at him. He recovered quickly, though, his face hardening into a mask of righteous indignation. "Accusations?" he boomed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Lies and slander. These are not insinuations, Father," David countered, his voice firm despite the tremor that ran through him. "These are facts. Hannah knew about your crimes, about the money you stole from your parishioners, from the people who trusted you." Duke growled low in his throat, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. The heavy oak doors of the church swung open with a resounding boom, revealing a group of villagers, drawn by the raised voices. They stood there hesitant, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion as they looked from David to Father Michael, unsure who to believe. "What's going on here?" asked Mrs. Hawthorne, the village elder, her voice trembling with a lifetime of respect for the cloth. "What's this talk of crimes and accusations?" David looked from the villagers' faces, their trust in their priest evident, to the priest himself, who stood tall, radiating an air of injured innocence. This was it, the moment of truth. He held up the metal box, the key to unraveling this web of deceit glinting under the dim church lights. "Hannah knew," he said, his voice clear and strong, echoing in the sudden silence. "And now, so will you." The air was thick with decay and forgotten memories. A single bare bulb cast a sickly yellow light. David scanned the room, his heart pounding. He moved cautiously, footsteps echoing. Duke padded silently beside him. The silence was broken by dripping water. David's flashlight fell upon a heavy wooden door. It was reinforced with iron bars and a heavy padlock. A shiver ran down his spine. This was where Hannah uncovered the darkness. He withdrew the key from his pocket. It fit perfectly into the lock. He turned it slowly, the mechanism groaning. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stone staircase that disappeared into darkness. The air that wafted up from the stairwell was cold and fetid, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet like blood. David hesitated for a moment, his hand tightening around the flashlight. He could turn back now. He could pretend he had seen nothing, heard nothing. But the thought of Hannah, of what she had endured, spurred him on. He took a deep breath and started down the stairs, Duke following close behind. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Father Michael, his eyes wild with rage, his face contorted in a mask of hatred. He was holding a heavy candlestick, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "You should have stayed out of this," the priest roared, his voice echoing in the confined space. "This is none of your concern." He lunged at David, swinging the candlestick with all his might. A desperate struggle ensued, the air thick with the sounds of grunts, snarls, and the sickening thud of flesh against stone. David, though smaller than the priest, fought with the ferocity of a man possessed, fueled by adrenaline and a righteous anger that burned hotter than any fire. Duke, sensing the danger to his companion, launched himself at Father Michael, sinking his teeth into the priest's arm. The priest screamed in pain, his grip on David loosening. David seized his chance, kicking out at Father Michael's legs, sending the priest crashing to the floor. David scrambled to his feet and pinned Father Michael to the ground, his knee pressed into the priest's chest, his hands twisting the priest's arms behind his back. "It's over, Father," he said, his voice shaking with exertion. "Your lies are finished." The sound of their struggle had attracted the attention of the villagers above. One by one, they rushed down the stairs, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror as they took in the scene before them. There, huddled in the corner, was Hannah. She was pale and trembling, her clothes torn, her wrists raw, but she was alive. David turned to the villagers, his voice trembling. "He kidnapped her," he said, pointing to the priest. And he would have gotten away with it if it hadn't been for Hannah and Duke. A wave of anger washed over the villagers. They turned on Father Michael, shouting, "You monster! You hypocrite!" The police arrived soon after. Father Michael was led away in handcuffs. As he was dragged past Hannah, their eyes met. David saw a cold, calculating hatred in the priest's gaze. The wheels of justice turned swiftly in Oakhaven. The evidence against Father Michael, gathered by David and corroborated by Hannah, proved irrefutable. The metal box of stolen donations symbolized his greed. Stripped of his robes, Father Michael was a shadow of his former self. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on his clasped hands. Silence met the judge's pronouncements. David recounted the events clearly. He spoke of Hannah's courage and Duke's loyalty. Villagers listened, their faith shattered. The verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge handed down a severe sentence. As Father Michael was led away, a collective sigh swept through the courtroom. Justice was served, but the scars ran deep. The days after Father Michael's arrest were a time of reflection and healing for Oakhaven. The villagers, their trust shaken, struggled to come to terms with the revelation. The church, once a sanctuary, stood empty, its doors bolted shut. Some villagers vowed never to set foot inside the building again. Others began the task of clearing out the remnants of Father Michael's deceit. Hannah returned to the village welcomed with open arms. David earned the respect and gratitude of the villagers. And Duke, the loyal companion, became a symbol of hope. As the days turned into weeks, normalcy returned to Oakhaven. The laughter of children replaced the whispers of suspicion and fear. The scent of freshly baked bread spoke of hope and new beginnings. The villagers of Oakhaven celebrated their heroes, David, the stranger who uncovered the truth, and Duke, the faithful companion. The village square was transformed into a scene of joyous celebration, filled with laughter, music, and home-cooked delicacies. Gifts were showered upon David and Duke, tokens of gratitude and respect. Children clustered around Duke, eager to express their thanks to the furry hero. As the sun set, David and Hannah shared a quiet moment, feeling at home in the village. With Father Michael's deceit behind them, the villagers of Oakhaven looked to the future with renewed purpose. The church, once a symbol of betrayal, was reclaimed and restored. A new priest filled with genuine faith was appointed. He spoke of forgiveness, redemption, and the power of the human spirit. His words resonated, offering comfort and hope. Life in Oakhaven began to flourish once more. The villagers embraced the future with appreciation for simple joys and the loyalty of a faithful companion. Oakhaven emerged stronger and more united. The legacy of deceit lived on in their determination to build a brighter future, guided by honesty, integrity, and compassion.